Jacob Hart had crossed into Redemption Flats that morning expecting nothing more complicated than a delivery of feed and lumber, a quiet transaction with a general store owner, and a quick ride back out before the heat of the afternoon settled into the dusty street. He had not expected, when he lifted the canvas flap of his wagon to check on the ropes he had loaded that morning, to find a woman crouched among his supplies, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her blue traveling dress dusty at the hem, and a small boy of no more than 4 years old pressed silently against her side with his face buried in her skirts. She flinched when the canvas moved, her eyes wide with a fear so raw it made Jacob's stomach twist, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the two of them frozen in a standoff neither had asked for. "Please," she finally whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry conviction. "I need you to pretend I'm your wife. Just until we're out of town. I will explain everything, I swear it, but there isn't time." Jacob glanced over his shoulder toward the street, where he could see 2 men on horseback moving slowly between the buildings, scanning faces with the particular intensity of men hunting something they intended to find, and something in his gut told him this woman's fear was not the fear of a liar. He had not survived 5 years as a rancher on the edge of contested territory, nor 3 years before that riding as a deputy through towns that chewed up careless men and spat out their bones, by ignoring his instincts, and his instincts told him now that whatever trouble had followed this woman into his wagon was trouble worth understanding before he made any decisions. But there was no time for questions, not with those riders drawing closer, so he made a choice that surprised even himself, a choice built more on some deep, unexamined sense of duty than on any careful reasoning. He nodded once sharply and said, "Get down low, both of you, and stay quiet." Then he dropped the canvas flap and walked to the front of the wagon with the unhurried gait of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, climbed up onto the bench, and clicked his tongue at the horses, guiding the wagon forward through the street as though this were any ordinary Tuesday. The riders intercepted him before he reached the edge of town, exactly as he had feared they might, and Jacob felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before trouble, an old, practiced calm settling over him like a second skin. The taller of the 2 men, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, asked if he had seen a woman traveling alone, dark-haired, with a young child, said she had stolen something valuable from a man named Wexler, and that there was a reward for her return, dead or alive, though he said the words with a leer that made Jacob's jaw clench. Jacob kept his expression carefully blank and said that he had seen no such woman, that he was simply a rancher hauling supplies home to his wife and son, who were resting in the back of the wagon after a long morning in town. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, flicking toward the canvas covering, and for one unbearable moment Jacob thought the lie would collapse under the weight of scrutiny. But then the woman's voice came from within the wagon, soft and irritated in exactly the tone of an exhausted wife, calling out to ask if they were nearly home because the boy was hungry. It was such a perfectly ordinary complaint, delivered with such convincing weariness, that the scarred man's suspicion visibly deflated, and after a moment more of studying Jacob's face, he tipped his hat and rode on with his companion, leaving Jacob to release a breath he had not realized he was holding. He did not stop the wagon until they were a full 3 miles outside of town, where a stand of cottonwood trees offered shade beside a shallow creek, and only then did he climb down and pull back the canvas to find the woman sitting with her knees drawn up, the boy asleep against her shoulder despite the tension that had gripped the wagon only minutes before, exhaustion having finally overtaken his small body. She looked at Jacob with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and terror, and it was there, in the dappled shade of the cottonwoods, that she finally told him her name was Eleanor, and that the man called Wexler was not someone she had stolen from, but someone she had fled, a husband whose cruelty had grown sharper and more dangerous with each passing year until she had understood, with the clarity of a woman who has finally run out of excuses to make for the man who hurts her, that staying meant one day not surviving at all. She had taken her son and left in the night 3 weeks earlier, working her way from town to town on whatever wagons and kindness she could find, always one step ahead of the men Wexler had paid to bring her back, men who did not particularly care whether she arrived alive. Jacob listened without interrupting, his jaw tight with an anger that had nowhere useful to go, and when she finished, he did not offer platitudes or false comfort, because he understood, in the particular way that men who have witnessed real cruelty understand, that comfort was not what she needed most in that moment. What she needed was safety, practical and immediate, And so he told her simply that his ranch was 2 days' ride further west, that it was modest but sturdy, that he lived alone since his own wife had passed 3 winters before from a fever that no doctor in the territory had been able to touch, and that she and her son were welcome to stay there, at least until she had gathered her strength and decided what she wanted to do next. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at the offer, tears she seemed determined not to let fall, and she asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, why a stranger would risk so much for a woman he had never met. Jacob considered the question seriously before answering, because it deserved a serious answer, and finally he said that he had learned, through loss of his own, that a person who turns away from someone in danger when he has the power to help is a person who will spend the rest of his life regretting it, and he did not intend to live with that particular regret. The journey to his ranch took 2 days, as he had said, and during those days something quietly remarkable began to happen between them, though neither would have named it so early. Eleanor, freed for the first time in years from the constant vigilance of fear, began to reveal glimpses of who she had been before Wexler had methodically dismantled her spirit, a woman with a sharp wit and a genuine curiosity about the world, who asked Jacob thoughtful questions about ranching and listened intently to his answers, who made her small son laugh with silly songs sung low under the wide sky. Jacob, for his part, found himself talking more in those 2 days than he had talked in the 3 years since his wife's death, telling Eleanor about Sarah, about the particular ache of building a life with someone and then watching it end too soon, about the strange guilt of continuing to live in a house full of memories that refused to fade. Eleanor listened to his grief the way he had listened to her fear, without flinching, without trying to fix what could not be fixed, simply bearing witness, and in that mutual bearing witness, something began to take root between them that neither had expected to find on a dusty road fleeing danger. When they finally arrived at the ranch, a modest but well-built house with a wide porch and a view of rolling hills that turned amber in the evening light, Eleanor stood in the yard for a long moment simply breathing, as though testing whether the air here felt different than the air she had been breathing for years, air thick with dread and calculation. Her son, whose name was Thomas, ran immediately toward the barn where Jacob kept 2 gentle mares, his exhaustion apparently forgotten in the face of new adventure, and Eleanor watched him go with an expression of such profound relief that Jacob had to look away, feeling as though he were witnessing something too intimate for a stranger's eyes. That first evening, Jacob prepared the guest room that had once belonged to his late wife's sister during her visits, and he told Eleanor, with careful formality, that she and Thomas could stay as long as they needed, that he expected nothing from her in return beyond honest conversation over supper, and that if Wexler's men ever came asking questions, the story they would tell was the same one that had already saved her once, that she was his wife and Thomas was his son, at least until real safety could be secured through proper legal channels. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite anticipated. Eleanor, unaccustomed to idleness and unwilling to simply accept charity, began helping with the daily work of the ranch, tending the small garden behind the house, managing the household accounts with a mathematical precision that impressed Jacob more than he let on, and gradually, almost without noticing it happening, becoming as essential to the rhythm of the place as the horses or the well. Thomas trailed after Jacob during the mornings, asking endless questions about cattle and horses and the mountains in the distance, and Jacob found himself answering with a patience he had not known he possessed, discovering in himself an unexpected tenderness toward this small boy who had known too much fear too young and deserved, more than anything, simple ordinary days of safety and wonder. In the evenings, after Thomas had been put to bed, Jacob and Eleanor would sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sharing the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel at ease with one another, and it was during one of these quiet evenings that Eleanor finally asked him the question that had clearly been troubling her for some time, whether the pretense they had begun as a lie to protect her from Wexler's men had, at some point she could not quite identify, stopped feeling entirely like a pretense. Jacob did not answer immediately, turning the question over with the same careful consideration he gave to any decision that mattered, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. He told her that he had not expected, when he lifted that canvas flap weeks ago, to find anything more than an unwelcome complication in his day, but that somewhere in the miles between that frightened first meeting and this quiet porch, he had found himself thinking of her not as a stranger he was protecting out of obligation, but as a woman he genuinely wanted in his life, not as a convenient fiction to fool dangerous men, but as something real and lasting. He said this with the plain, unadorned honesty of a man who did not know how to dress his feelings in prettier language than they deserved, and Eleanor, who had spent years learning to distrust every gentle word a man offered her, found to her own surprise that she believed him completely, because his gentleness had never once asked anything of her in return, had never once curdled into demand or control the way Wexler's had. Their peace was not left entirely undisturbed, however, for word travels even in wide, sparsely populated territories, and nearly 2 months after Eleanor's arrival, the same scarred man who had questioned Jacob on the road appeared at the ranch, having finally traced rumors of a woman matching Eleanor's description to this remote corner of the territory. Jacob met him in the yard with a calm that belied the tension coiled in his shoulders, informing the man plainly that his search had reached its end, that the woman he sought was indeed here, but that she was his wife under law, the marriage having been properly registered in the nearest county seat, and that Wexler's claim upon her had been formally dissolved through legal proceedings Jacob had quietly initiated weeks earlier upon learning the true extent of what she had suffered. This last part was, in fact, entirely true, for Jacob had ridden alone to the county courthouse 10 days prior, filing papers on Eleanor's behalf with a lawyer sympathetic to her situation, ensuring that whatever pretense had once protected her now stood on solid legal ground. The scarred man, faced with paperwork he could not dispute, and a rancher who made it clear through quiet, unwavering resolve that violence would be answered with violence, finally retreated, and word eventually came weeks later that Wexler himself, facing mounting legal troubles of his own making, had abandoned his pursuit entirely, choosing to cut his losses rather than continue a fight he could not win. With the threat finally, truly lifted, Jacob and Eleanor found themselves able to build their life together without the shadow that had hung over its beginning, and it was on a clear autumn morning, with the hills turned gold and Thomas chasing butterflies through the tall grass, that Jacob asked Eleanor, formally and with genuine nervousness despite the legal marriage already existing on paper, whether she would consider making the arrangement true in every sense that mattered, not merely as protection or convenience, but as a real marriage born of real love, entered into freely and without any shadow of fear or obligation. Eleanor, who had once believed that trust was a thing permanently broken in her, found herself weeping not from sorrow but from an overwhelming gratitude she had never expected to feel again, and she told him yes, that she loved him, that she had perhaps begun loving him somewhere on that dusty road when he had chosen, without hesitation, to risk everything for a stranger's safety, and that she wanted nothing more than to spend the rest of her life building something real with him. Something neither fear nor cruelty could ever again take from her. They held a small, proper wedding that winter, attended by the handful of neighbors who had come to know and respect Eleanor over the preceding months, and Thomas, now thoroughly at home on the ranch and fiercely attached to the man he had begun, entirely of his own accord, calling father, stood beside them throughout the ceremony with an expression of solemn pride that made more than one guest reach for a handkerchief. In the years that followed, the ranch grew and prospered, and 2 more children joined Thomas in filling the house with noise and laughter, and on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the stars had come out over the hills, Jacob and Eleanor would sometimes speak of that first frightened meeting in the back of a wagon, marveling at how a lie told out of desperate necessity had somehow, through patience and honesty and the slow accumulation of small kindnesses, transformed into the truest thing either of them had ever known. Eleanor would tell their children, when they were old enough to understand, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is trust a stranger's outstretched hand, and that sometimes, if fortune is kind, that stranger becomes not merely a rescuer but the truest companion a heart could ask for, proof that even the most frightening beginnings can, with enough courage and enough grace, grow into an ending more beautiful than anyone dared to imagine.